Hello and welcome back to my channel, Latveria Library, where I talk about all things comics. Today we will be talking about an X-Men story that centers around one of the most underutilized characters that also happens to be my favorite mutant, Legion. And yes, I know, at one point he was the leader of the X-Men, but still, we don't get to see him all that much. And he's probably one of the most interesting characters in the Marvel Universe. Think about it. The most powerful mutant, with autism and multiple personality disorder. Also with the potential to absorb other mutants' consciousness after their death. Desperately wanting a relationship with his father, Professor X, but never being able to have it due to a mixture of his powers and unstable mind. The possibilities are endless, and today's story is a perfect example of just what can be done with this fantastic character. David, or Legion, alters the world in such a drastic way that the X-Men will never be the same afterwards. So without further ado, let's get into the X-Men crossover event, Legion Quest. The story was created by all these writers and artists between multiple X-Men series. It begins when David Haller awakens from a coma. The Shadow King had taken over David's body in an earlier storyline. He was eventually defeated by Xavier and the X-Men, but unfortunately the battle had left David in a coma. Now he's finally awake, surrounded by the entire X-Factor team, but also Mystique. Filled with rage, her quest for vengeance has finally almost come to an end. She would make David pay for the death of Irene Adler, the love of her life, also known as Destiny. She lunged for David's neck. She wanted to take him out with her bare hands, but like a reflex, David blasted her back with a psychic blast. Mystique then takes off, vowing to chase Legion to the ends of the earth. David was very weak. That blast had taken a lot out of him. After all, it was the first time he had used his psychic powers in a while. But his mother was there to catch him. She tells him everything is alright, but David just says, "No, it's not, but I'm going to make it better. I'm going to make everything alright." He then passes out. We then cut to inside David's mind, and he is talking with Destiny. She wants him to convey a message to Mystique. It was very important that he get it to her. Later on, he awakens, talking to his father who wasn't there, which kinda worried his mother and Forge a little. That will come back into play later. We then cut to X-Factor. They had finally caught up to Mystique and give chase through the streets of Israel, ending with a one-on-one fight between Mystique and Forge. The two had trained together, so neither were making any headway. Every lunge is blocked, every attack is countered, until finally, Legion appears out of nowhere, knocks Forge out with a Psy Blast, breaking up the fight. He then links his mind to Mystique's. She felt the anger and bloodlust building within her, but there was nothing she could do within Legion's mindscape. He controls everyone and everything, so Mystique was forced to listen to what he had to say. He then begins to relay the message from Destiny. Beware of times not shared, hearts not loved, and destinies not written. He then releases her mind. X-Factor then takes this opportunity to try to rush him while he was distracted, but to no avail. They then vanished into thin air. Legion had teleported them somewhere far away. While all that was going on, Xavier was having a dream he was back in Israel during a time before the founding of the X-Men. It was a time in his life when he was the most at peace. Standing behind him was his longest and best friend Eric Lansher. The two reminisce about their time spent there, just two best friends with vastly different ideologies, convinced they could create a better world for mutants together. They thought about how young and naive they were. And Magneto then couldn't help but think, what would it have been like for Charles if he was never there to stand in his way? They both then look out across the sandy dunes, and the dead and decaying corpses of the people that had the misfortune of getting in the middle of their war appeared stretched across for miles. But it just wasn't that simple. If Magneto wasn't around, the world wouldn't have automatically been this perfect place for mutants. People would have still been bigoted towards them, and somebody else would have just taken Magneto's place, maybe even worse than him. And so they still would have been hunted down, and the infighting within the Mutant Brotherhood would have still happened. For better or for worse, Xavier knows that it isn't anyone's place to tamper with what was. Rather, they can only forge what is to be. But Magneto heavily disagreed. Except it wasn't Magneto, it was Xavier's son, David. He had taken over his father's mind, The dream he was in at this moment was created by his son. But suddenly, he let go, and Xavier springs up. Beast was standing over him. Apparently he had called out to him psychically. Beast then asked who had done it, who had attacked Charles. But he said that he wasn't actually attacked. The person was just trying to tell him something. Beast asked Charles who, and Charles told him, Legion. And this ends the setup for Legion Quest. Yes, we aren't even into the main story yet, but the setup is very important. So now, let's start the main story. The X-Men Gold Team landed in Israel at the request of the ambassador, Gabrielle Haller, Legion's mother. She was there waiting for them when they landed, and escorted them to a makeshift briefing room nearby. As they make their way there, they all notice wounded and dying soldiers being attended to. Apparently whatever they were up against chewed up and spit out the entire Israel army like it was nothing. A few kilometers away, Bobby, aka Iceman, notices what the cause of all the destruction was. It was some kind of black dome emitting some kind of powerful energy, and inside the dome was David Haller. He was the one creating all that energy. Gabriel then explains to them that the coma had somehow healed David's mind. He had finally gotten control of all the other personalities, and now he's more powerful than ever, 10 times more powerful than his father. In short, David was now a god. But it doesn't matter. The X-Men will do whatever it takes to save the people of Israel and David, because they owe everything they are to David's father, Professor X. Storm begins to conjure the biggest storm she has ever conjured before. The lightning and wind whipped around her violently, as she prayed and hoped it would be enough to stop David. She wills the lightning at him. Over and over again it strikes at the black dome of energy he had created around him, but nothing, not even a scratch. It really seemed like David didn't even notice the X-Men were there. So Storm begins to strike harder, giving it everything and more, as Bishop tried to siphon David's energy. But neither were having any luck. They were really in over their heads. Foolish to think they could best this godlike mutant. But there is one thing Storm still hasn't tried. Reasoning with David. She yells, "What drives you to cause such chaos and destruction? Do not ignore me." But David wasn't ignoring her. He knew they were there. He just wasn't listening. At this point, they were no more than ants to him. But he decided to show her anyway what this was all about. And with that, they both disappear before the team's eyes. The two reappear many years ago in Cairo, the day Aurora's mother was killed. She believed it to be just a cruel trick. But it was real. Legion had become so powerful he could rip holes in time itself, twist fate, and bend destiny to his own design. Storm begins to rush towards her mother, but as soon as they had gotten there, Legion had brought them back to where they began. He then tells her not to try and stop him, but applaud him, because he was about to change a critical moment for the glory of all mutant kind. But Bishop wasn't having it. He knew better than anyone else not to tamper with the time stream, so he lunged for David. But it was wasted effort. David swatted him away like a fly. He then began to rip another hole in the time stream. It was somewhat of a slow process, so this gave the X-Men Gold Team the opportunity to jump through with him, by Psylocke linking her mind to Bishop's, who still retained some of David's powers from the blast, which linked David to Bishop, kind of making a sort of rope that the rest of the team could hold on to. And with that, they all were able to follow whenever it was David was going, except for Jean, who had used all her strength to tether herself to this time. A little while later, Xavier has Rogue and Archangel search through the sandstorm for any sign of the Gold Team. Jean had called out to the professor psychically, so he knew at the very least she was out there. He then lets his two students know that his link with her was getting stronger, so they were getting close. And just like that, the two had found her half buried in the sand, but unfortunately, no sign of the others. They bring her back to the professor. She was weak and dehydrated, but Beast believed she'd be able to withstand a light mental nudge to wake her up. So the professor went ahead, and Jean jerked up, tears in her eyes, screaming Legion's name, but realized that she was okay when she saw Scott's face. Jean then tells all of them about how overwhelmingly powerful Legion has become, and how he took the rest of the team with him wherever he went. We then cut to the past. The Gold Team had been there for weeks now, and still have no idea why. Mainly because traversing the time stream had clouded their memories. The only thing they know are their names, and that they don't belong in this time, and they weren't the only ones. In a mental hospital nearby, a patient is being taken care of by a familiar face. The patient could feel the anger burning inside of Eric. It called to him, so he reached out and touched him, and the memories began to flood to the forefront of Eric's mind, and into the patient's. They saw the torture inflicted in the death camps during World War II, then Eric's daughter being burned alive by the people who hated and feared him. He begged and pleaded for the patient to stop, until he could not take it anymore. How dare this animal remind him of what he had lost? Eric threw him to the floor and ran off. He had never felt anything like it before. That boy had cut deep into his soul and tore it apart. He needed help. He needed to find Charles. But Charles already knew Eric was in need. He could hear his thoughts. They were screaming at him in pain. But things were far worse than either of them could have imagined. The patient, who I'm sure you all know by now as Legion, was on the floor, writhing in agony. His powers have gotten out of control. Projections from his mind seemed to begin to appear out of thin air. And then, something none of us are used to happened. Charles Xavier had no answers, no way of helping this boy. His greatest fears had come to pass, that mutants with certain abilities could be a danger to themselves and others. Then both seemed to think, simultaneously, what the hell had they gotten themselves into? Back in the present, Charles had called in Cable and Domino to help bring back the Gold Team, since they are kind of the resident experts on time travel. But unfortunately, his time displacement core had been out of commission for quite some time, but Cable wasn't the only one that had come to Charles' aid. Lilandra, Queen of the Shi'ar Empire, had shown up unexpectedly. Legion's actions has not only affected Earth, but the entire universe, and the Watchers have accompanied her to explain everything to everybody. It was pretty much what most of you probably assumed. Legion's tampering with the time stream has caused a tear in the fabric of reality that slowly grows bigger by the minute. But with the help of the Shi'ar Empire, the X-Men were able to create a device that will bridge time and prevent Legion from destroying everything. It's pretty complex, but the device connects Cable psychically to Jean and Charles. First, Charles will telepathically jumpstart Cable's latent time travel abilities, projecting his mind to the past, while Jean telekinetically holds Cable's body together. All this to try to repair the Gold Team's minds, and to warn them to stop Legion as soon as possible, or all is doomed. It's a risky plan, but it's their only hope. So the Shi'ar turn on the machine, and a tornado of psychic energy shoots up towards the sky. The X-Men have seen a lot in their time, but nothing like what they were witnessing now. Meanwhile, in the past, Psylocke has been psychically probing the minds of the others, hoping to unlock their memories. Unfortunately, the only thing she has learned is that Storm is their leader, but they all still cling to the hope that they're here for an important reason. Well, except for Bishop, who was beginning to lose that hope. Frustrated, he just stormed off and went back to work. Him and Bobby had gotten jobs as dock workers, which kind of tells me they have given up on getting home. Or at least Bishop has, since he takes the job way too seriously. Scolding Bobby for goofing off and not learning Israeli, seems to me he plans on being there a long time. But anyways, while Bishop was working unloading crates from the ship, two familiar faces passed him by. At that moment, Charles began to feel a monstrous darkness. Something was wrong with Gabrielle. Bishop hears Charles yell, and thought for a second that the voice sounded so familiar, but he completely forgot about it when Cable appears right before his eyes. He was frozen in place. His mind began to stir. He knew this man, somehow. The other X-Men come to his aid, which was perfect for Cable, because now he could restore all their minds at once. He reached out to touch Bishop's mind, pleading for him to remember. Cable's psychic energy then somehow extended to the rest of the X-Men, and finally, after weeks, they begin to remember everything, from the X-Men, to their fight with Legion, to following him through time. While that was going on, Xavier and Eric finally make it to Gabrielle. She was passed out on the ground while Legion hovered over her, memories fully restored, ready to finish his mission. Eric Lancher will die today. The two begin to fight over Israel, destroying everything in their path, while the people below scurry away like the ants they were to these two godlike mutants. What could anyone do against such massive power? Even the X-Men, now with their memories fully restored, just look on dumbfounded. Psylocke then reached out telepathically to the Charles of this time, and after a couple of attempts, she finally gets through. He races over to meet with them. Hopefully all together they can figure out something, but stops in his tracks when he saw what he had dreamed about countless times. More people just like him. It was absolutely incredible, but also terrifying because they all could be dangerous. Remember, the Charles of this time has only ever met one or two other mutants. He didn't even know if any others existed. All this chaos going on in the past has severely affected the future, especially the Macron crystal, which really needs its own video to explain, but the quick rundown is, it's a crystal older than time that is a nexus point for all realities. Because of the past, the crystal has caused some kind of crystallization wave throughout the universe. Whatever it washes over completely ceased to exist, which means, more than likely, the X-Men are failing at their mission in the past, and because of their failure, reality is completely being wiped out. There was nothing more anyone could do but say goodbye to the ones they love, then sit back and wait. They had mere minutes left. Back in the past, Apocalypse awaits patiently for what he was told was coming. It was happening earlier than he expected, but for him, it just means, as he put it, the Order of Ascension begins now. Over in Israel, the battle between Magneto and Legion rages on. Even though Eric is still young and inexperienced at this point in time, he was still holding his own against a godlike Legion, which really shows how powerful Magneto actually is. There is no question that he is an Omega level mutant. As the two continue their fight in the air, on the ground Storm had explained what was going on to Charles, that Legion was his son from the future, and that in his twisted warp reality, thinks that for his father's dream of peace for all mutant kind, Magneto must die. But really, he was destroying all that is. They then formed a plan. Iceman would distract Legion while Storm tries to keep Eric away from him. A pretty simple plan, but how they do it is pretty awesome. Iceman completely freezes every part of Legion's body, including all the water inside of him, which is something he had never done before, because of his morals, but it was necessary in this case. Unfortunately, it still wasn't enough. After about a minute, he was able to break free. The X-Men had no time to prepare themselves for David's massive telepathic energies. It tore through all their minds until David was the only one standing. He then walks over to Magneto. But none of this was right. He was condemning a man for atrocities he hadn't committed yet. Eric asked him how he was so certain. Legion's presence in the past had changed everything, and Eric may never become the monster Legion describes. But David could not trust him. His father spent so much time battling Magneto, trying to stop his madness, that he wasn't able to help others, wasn't able to help his own son. So if he killed Magneto now, none of that would happen. Legion then creates some kind of sword made out of energy around his fist. He brings it down towards Magneto's face, but suddenly, Charles jumps in front of him and Legion's energy sword comes down between Xavier's eyes. David had killed his own father, which means David was never born, which also meant that the X-Men never went back in time to stop him, because there were no X-Men. Charles would never create them. They all then disappeared, except for Bishop, who was a time anomaly, but his mind was damaged by the energies that had ripped away David and the X-Men. Back in the present, if you could call it that, the Macron crystal has washed over everyone and everything in the universe. So many lives that will never be. So many opportunities that will never be seized. So much potential lost. And with that, the world and our story ends with eerie silence. And now, the Age of Apocalypse begins. I hope you all enjoy this video. I left some things out, so you all should go pick up the story and check it out. There are some very good emotional moments with Scott and Cable, also some very good Charles and Magneto moments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy the video, and I'll see you next time.